Hello, World History. This is a lecture on the Cold War. This is Unit 12, Part 1, The Cold War Begins. A lot of the stuff that I'll talk about today you're going to be covering in 11th grade as well in U.S. History or AP U.S. History. But it's good stuff, and it's definitely worth learning twice. You might remember that during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, or the USSR, were allies fighting against Nazi Germany. But once Nazi Germany was defeated in 1945, the tension increased between the United States and the USSR. Some of the sources of tension were things like the systems that the Soviet Union and the United States had, both politically and then economically. Politically, the Soviet Union was communist, and from what that meant was it was a kind of dictatorship, and the United States was a democracy based on the will of the people. But then economically speaking, communism meant a planned economy, that there were government bureaucracies that planned everything that went along with the economy, whereas in the democratic United States there was capitalism, which meant that supply and demand and kind of the stuff that Adam Smith talked about was how the economy ran. Another source of tension were nuclear weapons that we'll talk about here at the end of this lecture. Having nuclear weapons meant that after about 1949 or so, both the United States and the Soviet Union could destroy each other and perhaps even destroy all the life on the planet. There were also some disagreements over territory, what to do with Germany, for example. Some of that stuff was worked out, but in the end, it wasn't really worked out. There was sort of a temporary solution. And then there were other territorial divisions, like what to do with Eastern Europe and what kinds of systems should they have? Should they have more of an American system or a communist? There was a peace conference or a meeting of the Allies called the Yalta Conference, in which it was agreed that Germany, once it was defeated, it would be divided up into zones, that it would be disarmed, and that some of the really guilty Nazis would face justice in the Nuremberg trials. The Soviets got the eastern quarter of Germany. It says eastern half there, but it's really the eastern quarter. And the United States, Britain, and France each got a third of three quarters in the western part. Berlin, which was in the Soviet zone, it was the German capital before the war and during the war, but after the war, it's not going to be the German capital anymore. For a period of time, there is no Germany, there is no German capital. It's just a land occupied by the winners of World War II. That too was divided into four sections, so it's kind of a weird little island in the middle of what will become communist East Germany. Also, at the end of World War II, a United Nations was established to prevent wars from happening in the future. It's supposed to be a place where all of the countries throughout the world are represented, and where they can each have their own say in the General Assembly, and they try to negotiate their way through conflicts so that war doesn't happen. Here's a map of the British zone and the American zone and the French zone in the western parts of Germany that become actually West Germany around 1949. And then the eastern zone, which was controlled by the Soviet Union, Berlin, as I said, sort of in the middle there. And then you can also see the map of Berlin on the right-hand side. Well, communism seeks to spread, just like capitalism, I suppose, seeks to spread. And the USSR wanted to create a cushion between itself and Western Europe. Russia or the Soviet Union had been invaded twice by the Germans in the 20th century, and they didn't want that to happen again. Terrible things had happened. 20 million Russians had died during the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union. So they wanted to create a cushion. You can see all of those countries in between that red border and the Soviet Union. That's Eastern Europe. Stalin takes that over, with the exception of Yugoslavia, but takes most of those states over with his army at the end of the war, chasing the Germans back into Germany. And of course, he wanted to create friendly governments that are like the Soviet Union, so communist governments, and that's what happens. All of Eastern Europe becomes communist. The United States and Great Britain were really quite alarmed by the spread of communism. The United States and Britain had freed the countries to the west of that red line, with the exception of Switzerland there, and wanted to have democracies and capitalism there, which is what eventually were established. That red line itself is the dividing line between the communist East and the capitalist West. And Churchill called this in a famous speech that he gave right after World War II, the Iron Curtain, a border between East and West. Well, the United States responded to the spread of communism into Eastern Europe and feeling like it could spread to other places with a policy called containment. And the containment policy was established by President Truman. And what he wanted to do was provide aid, economic and military aid, to support countries so that they would not become communist or they wouldn't fall under Soviet influence. In fact, there was a Truman Doctrine that was created that said that the United States will support free peoples in resisting outside pressure to become communist. And so the United States gave money to places like Greece and Turkey to make sure that they didn't go communist. By the way, containment and the Truman Doctrine mean that they are preventing the spread of communism. It doesn't mean that they're trying to undo communism in the places where it already existed. That would have been kind of a dangerous thing to do and maybe risk war if they had tried to do that. Another thing that the United States did around this period of time was called the Marshall Plan. They wanted, like I said, for countries to be capitalist, and so they provided money to all of these countries that wanted money in order to rebuild from World War II. And one of the stipulations of getting some of this $13 billion in aid is that they agree to basically be capitalist states. And so a lot of Western Europe was rebuilt with this American money, but that American money was then used by places like the Netherlands and Britain and France to buy stuff from the United States, and it was good for our economy too. So it's kind of a win-win situation. We also wanted to make sure that Western Europe in particular was free from being pressured into becoming communist. And so we formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. It was an alliance of the United States and Canada and Western European countries. If the Soviet Union tried to attack any one of those countries, they would be met by all of those countries banding together and fighting back. What NATO was all about. And the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries set up something, the Warsaw Pact, which was kind of similar. They were trying to protect communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And if any of those countries were trying to go capitalist, then they would be, invaded by the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries to keep them communist. There was a crisis in Berlin around 1940, 48, 49. What happened was this: the United States, Britain, and France decided to go against some agreements that had been made earlier and combine their three parts of Germany together and create a West Germany with West German money. And the Soviet Union really didn't like that, and so they set up their own East Germany, which was a communist government leadership. And then the United States tried to put pressure on West Berlin, the part that was controlled by the Americans, the French, and the British, by blockading West Berlin, or by keeping or cutting off the roads and the railways and so on from Europe or from West Germany going into Berlin. The United States and Britain together flew in all of the supplies that the people of West Berlin needed to supply themselves for about 9 months. They flew in flight after flight after flight. It was going around the clock, trying to supply 2.5 million people of West Berlin who wanted to remain part of the capitalist and the democratic part of the world. And this works. This Berlin airlift was a very risky operation, but successful. And eventually the Soviet Union gave up trying to blockade West Berlin. Well, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture, one of the really big and dangerous situations were nuclear weapons. We saw at the end of World War II that World War II ends when the United States drops a couple of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For a while, the United States is the only country with the atomic bomb. About 4 years after 1945, when those first atomic bombs were used, the Soviet Union researched and spied its way into also having atomic bombs. This became a different kind of world, a very dangerous world in which atomic warfare could happen, and you could have Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's happening, every day for some really long period of time and really destroying the entire world. Things got even much more grave or dangerous in 1952 and 1953 with the creation of a new kind of nuclear weapon called the hydrogen bomb, which was many, many, many times more powerful than what was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A hydrogen bomb or just really a few hydrogen bombs can really destroy all life on the planet. And The Soviet Union and the United States had lots and lots of these hydrogen bombs from the 1950s on, and still Russia and the United States still do. The ways that the hydrogen bomb could be delivered or sent to another country started off with bombers, first propeller-driven bombers, and then like you can see at the left bottom of your screen, a B-52 bomber. Giant bombers loaded with hydrogen bombs were one early way of delivering nuclear weapons. There were intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. That's the middle thing that you see there. Looks very much like a rocket that you might launch to the moon, but instead of going to the moon, it goes up into the atmosphere, comes down, and drops up to about 10 different bombs or different warheads on different parts of a country. There were also submarine launched rockets, and there were also cruise missiles. All of these different ways of delivering deadly cargo of the hydrogen bomb. And because of this, this in some ways made the world, much more dangerous and really on the cusp of mankind destroying itself. But perhaps because of both the Soviet Union and the United States having nuclear weapons, there was this thing called MAD, or mutually assured destruction, which is a situation in which if one side tried to launch an attack against the other side would see that launch coming and go ahead and launch their nuclear weapons at the attacking country, and both countries would be destroyed. They were, assured of destruction. And if that's the case, if either country tried to destroy the other and both are guaranteed to be destroyed, then it makes it virtually impossible for these countries to use their nuclear weapons. Nobody tries a sneak attack on anyone else. And this keeps the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union from going to war for many, many decades, assured of destruction. Well, I hope you enjoyed that lecture and took careful notes on it, got your EQs. Thanks, and have a great day.